This is breaking news coming out of the United States and Switzerland, a developing situation that marks one of the most bizarre and consequential weeks in modern transatlantic relations. We are receiving reports of a significant diplomatic de-escalation from the White House regarding the purchase of Greenland, a move that comes just as the global financial focus shifts entirely to Davos. What began as a headline that many dismissed as a rumor has rapidly evolved into a serious geopolitical pivot, exposing a stark divide between the old world scramble for territory and the new world battle for economic survival. Moments ago, confirmation emerged that the United States is effectively walking back its aggressive bid to purchase the world's largest island, a strategic gambit that had thrown NATO alliances into sudden turmoil. The President EOS' abrupt cancellation of his state visit to Denmark, initially triggered by the Danish Prime Minister's refusal to discuss the sale, has now transitioned into a reluctant Climbdown. State Department officials are scrambling to reframe the narrative, moving away from a transactional real estate deal toward a broader conversation about Arctic security. But make no mistake, the diplomatic damage is visible, and the message sent to European allies is resonating loudly across the Atlantic. However, the story does not end in Washington or Copenhagen. While the American administration navigates this diplomatic retreat, the center of gravity has shifted to the World Economic Forum in Davos. In a stunning contrast of leadership styles and global priorities, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and current UN Special Envoy, has effectively hijacked the global agenda. While the US headlines are dominated by a failed land acquisition, Carney has commanded the room in Switzerland, rallying trillions of dollars in private finance to combat the very climate crisis that is melting the ice sheets of Greenland in the first place. This creates a split-screen moment in history that is almost too perfect to be scripted. On one side, you have the resurgence of 19th century imperialism, a desire to buy land for strategic dominance. On the other, you have the 21st century realization of existential risk, where the financial elite are being told that their assets are worthless if the planet burns. The Climbdown regarding Greenland is not just a change in travel plans. It is a signal that the traditional methods of projecting power are colliding with a new, complex reality. What we are witnessing today is the friction between two entirely different worldviews, and the outcome of this week will likely define the trajectory of the coming decade. To understand how we arrived at this moment of diplomatic whiplash, we have to look past the sensationalism of the headlines and examine the machinery of influence that has been grinding behind the scenes. The concept of the United States purchasing Greenland did not emerge from a vacuum. It was, according to sources close to the situation, a calculated, albeit clumsy attempt to reassert American dominance in the Arctic, a region that has become the next great frontier for geopolitical competition. Russia is militarizing the North. China is declaring itself a near-Arctic state. In this context, the White House saw a real estate deal where others saw a sovereign nation. When the news first broke, it was met with a mixture of incredulity and amusement. The idea that a semi-autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark could be bought like a distressed asset seemed to belong to a different era. But as the president doubled down, canceling a long-planned diplomatic visit because Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen labeled the discussion absurd, the amusement turned into alarm. This was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a stress test of the Western alliance. For several tense days, the relationship between Washington and Copenhagen, one of America's staunchest allies, hung in a precarious balance, threatened by what was essentially a disagreement over a property listing that never existed. The Climbdown we are reporting on today is the result of frantic back-channel diplomacy. Career diplomats, military strategists, and foreign policy experts have been working around the clock to salvage the relationship without the president losing face. The language coming out of Washington has shifted from buying Greenland to expanding strategic presence. It is a subtle but vital distinction. It is an admission that while the objective of Arctic control remains, the method of outright purchase was a miscalculation that ignored the self-determination of the Greenlandic people and the sovereign pride of Denmark. But while Washington walks back its ambitions, Mark Carney has stepped forward in Davos to fill the leadership vacuum. The contrast is jarring. While the American narrative was focused on the acquisition of territory, Carney's message to the global elite was about the preservation of the system itself. In a series of speeches and private sessions that have reportedly stunned seasoned investors, Carney has laid out a stark ultimatum. Companies and countries that ignore the climate transition will go bankrupt. He isn't talking about politics, he's talking about math. Carney, Wart's dominance at Davos this week is significant because it represents a changing of the guard in how global crises are managed. For decades, the world looked to the US president to set the agenda. If the president was focused on Greenland, the world focused on Greenland. But Carney has managed to steal the show by speaking the language that Davos understands best: risk and return. By mobilizing the private financial sector, banks, insurers, and asset managers, he is bypassing the political gridlock that led to the Greenland debacle. He is effectively saying that if governments are too distracted by buying islands to save them, the markets will have to intervene. The irony of the situation is palpable. The very island that the US president sought to purchase is ground zero for the crisis Carney is trying to solve. Greenland is not just a strategic rock in the ocean. It is the repository of enough frozen water to rewrite the world's coastlines. While the diplomatic dispute was over who owns Greenland, the financial discussion in Davos is about who pays for the consequences of its melting. This thematic collision, ownership versus stewardship, is the defining conflict of our time. As we analyze the fallout of the US Climbdown, it is crucial to recognize the human element often lost in high-level geopolitical maneuvering. For the 56,000 people living in Greenland, this week has been a surreal experience. They have watched as their homeland was debated as a commodity on cable news, their sovereignty questioned, and their future treated as a bargaining chip. The eventual de-escalation from the US is a victory for their autonomy, but it leaves behind a lingering unease. They have been reminded in the starkest terms possible of their immense strategic value to superpowers who view the Arctic map as a chessboard. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Davos has shifted from the usual self-congratulatory networking to a more somber realization of urgency. Mark Carney's success in capturing the narrative suggests that the business world is beginning to price in risks that politicians are still arguing over. The climb down in Washington may be a return to diplomatic norms, but the step up in Davos is a departure into uncharted territory. The financial sector is signaling that they can no longer wait for coherent political leadership to address the climate crisis. This brings us to the broader implications of the week's events. The U.S. administration, AMD's retreat from the Greenland purchase, is likely to be spun as a strategic pivot, a way to maintain dignity while acknowledging the impossibility of the transaction. But the damage to the perception of American focus is real. Allies are asking if the U.S. is distracted by vanity projects, while the structural foundations of the global order are cracking. The climb down is a relief to NATO, but it is also a symptom of a foreign policy that often prioritizes the spectacular over the substantial. Conversely, Mark Carney's ascent as the primary voice of reason at Davos highlights a vacuum in global political leadership. When a central banker becomes the most compelling moral voice in the room, it suggests that the traditional power structures are failing to provide the vision required for the 21st century. Carney's warning of a Minsky moment, a sudden collapse in asset values, due to climate risk, has resonated more deeply than any political speech given this week. He has effectively argued that while you cannot buy Greenland, you can certainly lose the global economy if you fail to understand what Greenland represents. The narrative arc of this story is far from over. The United States has not abandoned its interest in the Arctic. It has merely changed tactics. We can expect to see an increase in U.S. military presence in the region, more consulate openings, and perhaps direct aid packages to Greenland, efforts to buy influence rather than land. The climb down is tactical, not strategic. The great power competition for the North is just beginning, and this week, diplomatic theater was merely the opening act of a much longer struggle for control over the top of the world. Simultaneously, the momentum generated by Carney at Davos faces its own hurdles. Promises made in the Swiss Alps often evaporate when they meet the hard realities of national economies and quarterly profit targets. However, the sheer scale of the capital he is mobilizing, trillions, not billions, suggests that a tipping point has been reached. The financial markets are moving faster than the diplomats. While Washington was figuring out how to walk back a request to buy an island, Wall Street was busy figuring out how to price the end of the carbon age. As we watch this story develop, the juxtaposition remains the most striking element. On one hand, a retreat from a vision of the world defined by borders and ownership. On the other, an advance toward a vision defined by interconnectivity and shared risk. The U.S. President's reluctance to let go of the Greenland idea speaks to a nostalgia for a time when power was measured in square miles. Mark Carney's dominance at Davos speaks to a future where power is measured in resilience and sustainability. The events of the last few days have served as a stress test for the international system, revealing both its fragility and its surprising adaptability. The swift rejection of the purchase offer by Denmark and Greenland showed that sovereignty is not entirely for sale, even when the buyer is the world's sole superpower. The subsequent U.S. climb down, however reluctant, demonstrates that diplomatic norms still hold some sway, acting as guardrails when executive ambition veers off the road. Yet, as the dust settles on the diplomatic spat, the silence of the Arctic remains the most powerful voice in the room. The ice does not care about purchase offers or Davos manifestos. It responds only to physics. And as the political and financial worlds collide, the reality of the changing planet continues to accelerate. indifferent to the human dramas playing out in Washington and Switzerland. The Climbdown buys time for diplomacy, but as Mark Carney made clear to a hushed room of billionaires, time is the one asset that cannot be bought. We are entering a new phase of this story, one where the headlines will likely shift from the absurdity of the purchase offer to the serious reality of Arctic security and climate finance. The cameras may leave the State Department briefing room, but the geopolitical maneuvering will continue in the shadows. And while the U.S. administration licks its wounds, the question that remains is whether the momentum from Davos can translate into action before the very subject of this dispute, Greenland as ice, changes the world map irrevocably. This is a story of two summits, one that never happened, and one that changed the conversation. The cancelled trip to Copenhagen and the successful gathering in Davos are two sides of the same coin, reflecting a world in transition. We are witnessing the friction between the way the world used to work and the way it must work to survive. And as we continue to monitor the fallout from the White House's reversal, one thing is abundantly clear. The map of the world is being redrawn, not by the stroke of a pen on a purchase agreement, but by the rising tides of a new global reality. Break for continuation if necessary, or concluding thought. The reluctance of the Climbdown suggests that this administration does not take our no for an answer easily. We should expect the U.S. to return to the Arctic question with renewed vigor, perhaps less publicly but more forcefully. The opening of a consulate in Nuuk was a first step. What follows will likely be a concerted effort to woo Greenland away from European dependency and check Chinese expansionism. The deal is dead, but the strategy is very much alive. And for Mark Carney, the challenge now is execution. Stealing the show at Davos is one thing, re-engineering the global financial system is another, but for a brief moment this week, the technocrat outshone the politician, and the focus shifted from the art of the deal to the art of survival. In a world drowning in noise, the signal finally cut through.